Everybody, I am delighted to welcome you to today's instance of the Perspectives in Global Development series with Dr. Loka Ashwood from the University of Kentucky. And it's how to even begin to introduce Loka. Today you are getting a chance to see in action an exemplar of a truly engaged researcher, someone who comes to rural problems by meeting residents in place to learn about their concerns and their experiences. It helps that Loka comes from a farm family and a farm community, and she has, over the course of her career, done a great deal of work with people in rural communities on fighting rural water pollution, on fighting back against the entry of a large hog raising operation, identifying and getting response to cancer clusters. She's in the process of this work, not only helped make a difference in rural communities, but also made key contributions to rural sociology, including in drawing on feminist epistemologies, participatory research, and collaborative knowledge generation, to bringing environmental justice studies to a bigger focus in rural contexts, to her book For-Profit Democracy, which looks at communities that are affected by the new construction of a nuclear plant, to understand how majoritarian institutions subjugate rural people and places, and how people understand and resist this subjugation. Today, she'll be talking about her newest co-authored book, Empty Fields, Empty Promises. And I will cede the floor to her. Thank you so much for coming, Loka.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Is this okay? Okay, great. Thank you so much for coming. And Jack, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. We actually went to graduate school together for a few years too, so we're old friends. I just want to, I've had such a lovely time so far, and I really want to thank Mariah also for doing an outstanding job making sure I got here. It was really enjoyable just even coming here. Just even driving into campus and seeing the agricultural buildings coming in from Syracuse was a beautiful thing. The connection here between farming and a land grant institution and then the private assets that you also have at this university is really incredible. And you have such a strong history in rural sociology in my field, so it's very, very much so a real honor to be here. So Jack mentioned that I do deep engaged work with rural communities. And I think one of the best ways that I can start off today is tell you two stories that we kick off our book with that really give you a sense of what right to farm laws are doing in rural communities and their role in dispossession. So if you'll hear me out for a moment, I want to start with the story of Paul A. Lewis. So for 2 generations, Paul A. Lewis and his family, they made White Oak, North Carolina, their home. So Mr. Lewis's mother took her first breath on their 160-acre farm, born on an expanse that, unlike many Black families that came before them, they could proudly call their own. They owned it. So Mr. Lewis and his family, they treasured their rural living, their outdoor cookouts and hanging clothes on the line and drawing water from their well. Mr. Lewis described his home as quiet and peaceful until 1995, when a concentrated animal feeding operation started fattening 14,700 hogs, 14,700, just 600 yards from his family home. He described how the stench rushed through the half-mile of timber between his homestead and the hog confinements. He described how the odor and dust particles started clinging to clothes on the line. Like you see here, these are some of the pleasures of rural living, getting to hang your clothes out on the line. He said that his family's cookouts and barbecues, they came to a stop. Swarms of flies and other insects gathered around the porch and made their way inside the windows. Dead hogs fell off trucks running in the night. Manure mist and fumes from the lagoon and spray field system made it difficult for Mr. Lewis to breathe. In the unfolding years, he was diagnosed with asthma, chronic skin disorders, sinus problems, depression, and a suite of other health issues. So this is North Carolina, where Mr. Lewis lived. So it appeared that he might finally have his day in court when he filed a complaint against the hog operator Murphy Brown, LLC, in 2020, not too long ago. He did so by saying this was in defense of his property rights. He alleged that the pollution was a nuisance that took away the enjoyment of his home and the use of his land. He also sued for negligence, stating that the company, Murphy Brown, a subsidiary of the WH Group Limited, that they knew the harmful effects of the operation, but they continued anyway. And the ultimate beneficiaries of Murphy Brown LLC trace back to the WH Group. It's one of the largest financial food holding companies in the world. Now I want to skip for a moment from North Carolina and jump across the country to Fort Branch, Indiana, and tell you the story of Glenn and Phyllis Parker, who similarly looked to the courts for justice. So just like Mr. Lewis, Mr. Parker's mother had passed the farmland down to him. Together, the Parkers built their lifelong home on the land in 1972 without a second thought to the neighboring 100-head dairy that had existed there as long as anybody could remember. It was a family dairy. Mr. Parker himself had farmed part-time until he retired in 2005, and he decided to rent the land to a local grain farmer. 5 years later, the once familiar dairy farm added a 900-head dairy CAFO, concentrated animal feeding operation, and incorporated it, turned it into a limited liability company just a stone's throw away from his home. Less than a year after it became operational, the elderly Parkers, an elderly couple, they filed a nuisance suit alleging noxious odors and property devaluation. This is how, if you look at the deposition on the case, Mr. Parker talked about it. He said, just like Mr. Lewis, the odor lingers in our garage and in our clothes. When we open the back door, it reefs into the kitchen. We often have people come and visit us say, how do you stand this? He furthered, you go from a family farm that doesn't bother anybody to one who makes your life almost unbearable. So here's the question that I want to pose, and this is why we wrote this book. What do you think the outcomes of these cases were in court, these two that I described? Do you think that they won their nuisance litigation suits? They didn't. They didn't. So this is what drove us, and I'm going to get to the us, to do this research. Mr. Lewis and the Parkers, they lost in court based on a right to farm defense that these limited liability companies were able to use to defend their operations. That's why they lost, because they did not receive status as farms themselves. So when I say us, I'm one of a group of 5 authors on this book, and 3 of them are lawyers. And I just want to, their beautiful faces are up here. This is Amy Imlay, a sociologist, Lindsay Kuhn, works for the Farmers Legal Action Group, Danny Diamond, and Alan Franco. And if you want to follow along with anything I'm talking about today, you can just scan Tron and you can open up a copy of the book that's free online if you want to read in more detail. So these are the people, the Parkers and the Lewises. Do I need to fix something? We're okay? Oh, I see. Okay. So these are the folks that inspired us to do this work, amongst many other stories that I'm going to be talking about today. But I also want to talk about, we completed in this book the first national analysis of right to farm laws. So what they do on a per state basis, you can open it up. You can look at New York right now or any other state in the country to have a manual, an access point to see what's going on in your state. That's one reason we did it. But another reason is the outcomes of these laws on the aggregate, on a national scale, were not known. And furthermore, they're largely overlooked nuisance litigation, negligence litigation, anything that's situated in property rights as a way in which to protect the environment. So often what we see in environmental law and policy is either a favoring of command and control, regulatory-based approaches to environmental protection, or In contrast, property rights are often seen as a way to commodify nature in order to protect it. So you see this a lot with climate change legislation that we're looking at. But you see very little mention of property rights actually as a tool through thinking about property rights as a bundle rooted in common law as a way in which to actually protect the environment. And in rural areas, this is absolutely crucial because rural areas are largely overlooked by the regulatory state and the regulatory apparatus. So when you don't have agency level support or continued environmental water monitoring, what do you turn to? Your last recourse is your property rights. So that's one reason why we think that this work hadn't been done before. And often, especially in sociology and geography circles of which I operate, we consider dispossession as a one-done thing. Once something is commodified, once it becomes private property, that's it. Or there may be a wave of a new structural regime that comes through, but we miss these mediating effects of how we're taking away certain elements of private property. Like, for example, your right to enjoy and use and have a home on your property. So then we miss these legal aid tools that people who are living in the starkest context of environmental injustices, they need help right now. So we're not in those places and perhaps providing them the legal aid that we could. And we see this as potentially a way to seed hope in action. We call this a praxis-centered approach. At the R, the agricultural, rural, and environmental interface. But we're operating in a national context right now, and I'd like to hear more about how it is in New York. Where right to farm laws, when you hear that at an everyday level, you think, oh, great, everybody should have the right to farm. And these laws were proposed in the 1980s during the farm crisis, when we had farmers going out of business in droves. Farmer suicides peaked during that time. We had a fundamental restructuring of rural economies around the country. And that's when these laws began to be proposed as a way to keep farmers on the land, often by framing them in opposition to urban areas and urban people who were a threat to rural sustenance. So right to farm laws use this idea of agricultural exceptionalism to say that ag operations are different. We need to protect them, especially from these urbanites who are attacking rural areas. They don't understand our way of life. They can't stand the sound of a cow bellowing, for example. And that was a way in which, sort of capitalizing on crisis, as Greta Krippner would say, to pass these laws in that moment as a way we're going to solve this crisis. So even right now, as I'm in this room telling you these particular stories, and I'll talk about the outcomes of these laws on a national level, there's controversy. There was just recent controversy in Texas where you'll see right to farm laws, amendments proposed saying we need stronger protections for farmers. We need more protections for farmers. So there's actually uncertainty and debate about what the actual outcomes of these laws are. And in our engagement with rural communities, that's when we realized the study needed done to see who is actually winning using right to farm laws on a national level. And then more specifically, can we find trends according to race, poverty, state attributes like political economic structures? So that's what we did. And that's why I have 4 co-authors, right? Because yeah, it was a lot of work, but we did it together. We looked at 50 years of case law that was gathered by the 3 lawyers on the team that are really good at using Westlaw and LexisNexis. We got all the original statutes and the current ones up to 2021, so we could see what they initially said they were going to do and how they changed over time. And then we created a code book that we used across us 5 coders to find trends in these laws, thematic trends, and so we could compare different statutory elements across the country. And then using NVivo, it's the software system that always crashes on us. You all, yeah, did a lot with this data set. We use Census of Ag and forestry data you're going to see if we could find trends at state level attributes of how many hogs there are in a state. What's the timber inventory? What do we have in terms of layers and broilers? Those are technical terms for chickens. So, and then we could look at the geopolitical context that could be shaping these laws. And then we looked at rural racial minority numbers and rural poverty numbers then to see if we could see trends at the state level in case outcomes based on these sociodemographics. So just to give you a key point, this is where we're at right now with right to farm laws. So I gave you the stories of the Parkers in Indiana and Mr. Lewis in North Carolina. But in Indiana, I see that slide has kind of slipped down a little bit, sorry on that. In 1987, when this law was being supported, this is an example of the kinds of language that's been used to support their initial passage, but also their current support of adding more and more amendments that are stripping away more and more elements of property rights that I would say are more conducive to an agriculture of home. So in Indiana, the Indiana Farm Bureau president in 1987 said, hopefully this will send a message to the public that if they move next to a farmer, they have to accept how he operates. I want you to notice that they're moving in. The urban folks are moving in next to a farmer. So we need to send this message. But this wasn't just going on in 1987. It continues now. I gave you the example in North Carolina, right, of Mr. Lewis. So listen to this. This is from Smithfield Foods vice president. It's also a subsidiary of WH Group, which also has the subsidiary Murphy Brown that I mentioned earlier. Their vice president of corporate affairs, in referring to some of the right to farm case outcomes, said negative verdicts have scared family farmers, right, with this proposition that these laws are protecting family farmers. In states whose livelihood and fundamental character depend on agriculture, legislation seems like a common sense reaction to what many understandably perceive to be a threat to their ability to earn a living in their cherished way of life. So is this true? Did these laws protect family farmers? We found in our analysis of all of the original statutes across the country that one specifically tailored right to farm protections to family farms initially, and that was Minnesota. So in this case, Minnesota, if you look at their original statute, said only family farms can access these right to farm protections. But since then, this language has been repealed and replaced with this amended language, which we see in almost every right to farm law across the country, some variant that said, you know, we're generally going to protect operations or facilities that produce a variety of crops, livestock, poultry, dairy products, et cetera. So I want to get into the details of how these laws are enabling the kind of dispossession that we talked about, beginning with the Parkers. So if you look at our book, you can turn to any state that you're interested in this case, Indiana. And one of the major trends that we found is in this first part, where operations receive immunity. So these are the kinds of elements that have been passed that give the most power to corporate agribusiness and dispossess the folks like the Parkers the most. So right now in Indiana, if you're an agricultural operation, you can change your size or your boundaries. You'll still have protection from nuisance suits. If the locality around you changes, you'll have protection from nuisance suits. If you use a new technology, if you produce a different product, that's a huge one, right? So if you go from a small scale dairy operation or a vegetable farm and you change to a concentrated feeding animal operation, even if the family farm next to you has predated it, you're still protected from any sort of nuisance suits. This is also a key one. These are two key ones. If they produce it, once they're in operation for a year, and then finally, even if your ownership changes, you're protected. Now in North Carolina, this is one of the most important statutes that we see as an affront to democracy and a tool of dispossession, which is that right to farm laws supersede local ordinances and laws. This is a way in which local control through municipalities, local zoning, even just your little township out in a rural community or a parish, if you're down in Louisiana, you cannot pass a law that tries to regulate to any extent these operations. And we're seeing this now in 62% of right to farm laws nationally. Now I want to skip to a different state for a moment, which is Missouri. because we feature Missouri a lot in our book too. It's one of only 2 states that has a constitutional amendment that protects the right to farm, which is something we can get more into. But this particular case was before the constitutional amendment was passed in Missouri, but still, at this time in 1997, this is the case outcome. Lincoln Township, just a little township in Missouri, they wanted to have some local oversight over Premium Standard, which is now also a subsidiary of WH Group, I might add, in Smithfield. So that's another story because they eventually went bankrupt. But at that time, they proposed 96 hog confinements. Just imagine the scale. That required 12 58-acre hog manure lagoons. Imagine. Yeah, right. It's almost beyond comprehension. All they were asking is for $750,000 in a case of a spill for each lagoon to have that bond in place. So they had this, the township had this vote of the people to quote, that they sought to exert oversight designed for the purpose of promoting health, safety. This is to quote their language of the township. We want to promote the health, safety, morals, comfort, or the general welfare of the unincorporated portion of the township, to conserve and protect property and building values, to secure the most economical use of the land, and to facilitate the adequate provision of public improvements. Premium Standard said no. We refused to comply. And so it responded by suing the township. Premium Standard did, and they won. The court concluded in 1997 that the township and the county had no authority to govern as such because the right to farm law protected Premium Standard. The court designated the livestock sewage lagoons and finishing buildings as farm structures protected by the Missouri right to farm law. It concluded then that the setback and bonding requirements were impermissible, as zoning could not impose regulations on farm buildings or structures. So that's a case of what happened in Missouri. Now, I've given you a few specific cases, and you might be like, well, what about on the aggregate? What happened overall? So I want to talk about the general outcomes of right to farm cases just by looking at, this is part of our use of attributes, defining party types as plaintiffs or defendants in right to farm cases. We identified, who are the most predominant party types. So we had landowners, folks who own land that we could identify, any sort of governmental body, ranging from the local to the state, business firms. That includes limited liability companies, limited liability partnerships, corps, anything that's a business firm, uses a business firm structure. Residents, somebody who lives in a place. Homeowners, which isn't the same thing as residents, because you could live in a home, but you could rent it or not own it, like if you live with your family, your parents. And then sole proprietor farmers. That means a farmer that operates by their own name. And then concentrated animal feeding operations. So these are the most predominant party types and right to farm laws. So I just want to point out, as you're looking at this, when I get to the next slide, which is going to show who wins the most, that the vast majority of family farms, 89%, are operated as sole proprietorships. This is according to the USDA in 2018, right? Sole proprietorships, vast majority of family farms are sole proprietorships. Now, here's who we found wins the most in these cases. So when they go to court, these are the party types that win the most. And we divide this into defendants, plaintiffs, and also split rulings. Concentrated animal feeding operations, even though in the last slide you'll see that they're the least common party type, they win the most cases when they go to court. Versus sole proprietor farmers, this one really surprised us, are the least successful party type in court, even after homeowners and residents. So this was a shocking finding for us, that they're actually the least successful party type. Now, I want to give you a sense of why. I want to go back to Missouri. where you saw Premium Standard Farms, the subsidiary of WH Group, won. In this case, even after the constitutional amendment had been passed, adopted in Missouri, so this is in 2016, 19 years after the Premium Standard ruling, the farmer Eric Vimont, and I won't get into the specifics of the health risks of this, but he sued the Christian County Health Department when they said he could not sell raw milk at his county farmers market. The court disagreed and upheld the health department's ordinance barring the sale and distribution of raw milk. So he tried to use the right to farm law to say, I can sell my raw milk at the county market. And they said, no, the right to farm law does not protect you. So there's this level of disparity in terms of political economic status between business firms and CAFOs and sole proprietor farmers. Okay, so just to think about a timeline of right to case law, of right to farm case law. So if you look here, you can look at the governmental body wins and the CAFO and or business firm wins. You kind of can't see that up in the corner. But essentially for this graphic, we combined CAFOs and business firms into one group because sometimes they're overlapping. That's one thing I should have mentioned in my previous slides is you'll notice none of those percentages add up to 100. And that's because you can be multiple party types. It was a way that we had to compute this in vivo, for example. You can be a landowner and a CAFO, right? You can be a homeowner and you can also be a sole proprietor farmer. So that's why none of those percentages, they're overlapping party types. I'm sorry I didn't mention that. But there's a way that we can in vivo is we can group party types together to reduce overlapping cases. So we did that for this graphic. And when we group CAFOs and business firm wins together, and we compare them to governmental body wins, you can see that more recently, CAFO and business firms are winning more. And we have more right to farm litigation playing out over time, generally. But what has not happened over time is the number of farmers certainly hasn't increased. I'm sure some of you have seen the latest US Census data. It's heartbreaking. And we anticipated this when we wrote our book. We said hogs, that's why they're on our cover. Hog farmers have had the most precipitous decline in the United States. We've lost 87% of hog farmers in the United States over a similar trajectory of time that we use for a 50-year analysis of right to farm laws. 87%. 9 out of 10 of those hog farmers have gone out of business. All right, it's staggering. Now I think it'd be dairy farmers after the latest census. It's heartbreaking, right? While we're writing this book, we saw what was happening to dairy farmers in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and you know that well here in New York. So we see this precipitous decline. So right to farm laws, their time period overlaps with a mass exodus of farmers. So how can we explain why this is happening? I've given you the details. It's discouraging, right? It's discouraging. We don't want to leave anything there, but I want to talk about the patterns and the processes of dispossession that can help us understand where this is happening on the aggregate and perhaps why, so we can reverse it. So if you look at the case part, at the case law outcomes, and you look at them regionally, by far, the most litigation is playing out in the Midwest of the United States. This may come as a surprise because we focus a lot on the Southeast in news media. That includes North Carolina. And it's a crucial state to look at. Indiana, however, has the most, in Indiana, CAFOs and business firms are winning more than any other state in the nation. That was another surprise. People don't talk about Indiana. North Carolina's second. And I'll get to our reasoning why. But if you look here, you can see when you hop regionally, the Southeast is still very important because look, business firms win proportionately more. I'm going to talk about that again in a moment. How in the Southeast, in our poorest states in the country, business firms really predominate those party outcomes. But just to put some of these numbers in another perspective, so in the Southeast, business firms win 3.7 times more often than governmental bodies. In the Northeast, where we're at right now, You can see where the Northeast is at. The trends are very different. Governmental entities win twice as often as business firms and 14 times more often than CAFOs in the Northeast. So when we look regionally, we see a major disparity within the United States. And so here's one way in which we find it helpful to explain this. And this is, of course, not utilizing the most recent census data because we didn't have access to it. But we decided to classify, based on US Census numbers, the top 5 states in each of these different sectors. So hog inventory, milk cow inventory, beef cow inventory, broilers and layers, that's a term for poultry, and then timber harvested. And these are the states in the United States that are at least in the top 5 for one or sometimes 2 of these sectors. And we found some really important trends when we organized not just regionally in the United States, but we looked at these geopolitical sites of extraction. So we found that CAFOs win in part or full every single case that they are party to in the top 5 states for broilers and timber. So CAFOs win in part or in full every single case they are party to in the top 5 states for broilers and timber. And I just want you to look for a moment at where those states are, right? You're seeing Alabama, you're seeing Georgia, and you're seeing Mississippi. I'm going to talk about them in a moment. CAFOs win 83% of the cases they are party to in the top 5 dairy states. And you can read up here, CAFOs as a party type win more cases in total in the top 5 hog states than in any other top 5. So that's just the actual number of cases they win, not the percentage. Now, this is one contribution that I have to really point to Amy Imlay's very important work. She's an assistant professor of sociology at Mississippi State. She looks at county level rural poverty data. And what we did is we decided to look at how much rural poverty had increased in the Midwest from 1980 to 2020. General time period of right to farm laws, not exact, but fairly close. So based on her analysis, we found that poverty rates increased in 33% of rural counties in the Midwest over this time period. So what we found when we aggregated all of the states by rural poverty level, so if you're thinking about this, persistent poverty counties are when you have a county where 20% or more of the population is impoverished for over 3 decades, over 30 years. So we kind of used those poverty levels. Our high level poverty level was that 20% threshold. And then the median poverty county was 10 to 19%. And what we found is that every Midwestern state falls into this category. But what we're proposing, and this is where I think this kind of research can help to stop dispossession or reverse processes that are so problematic, as we're seeing a path, a midburden, a path to poverty happening in the United States right now in the Midwest through dispossession, through right to farm laws. Now, what about when we look at race? Now, this is where it's really important to go back to Mississippi, to Alabama, to Georgia, and to Louisiana. I'm not talking about a lot of the timber case outcomes, but please read about them in the book because it's phenomenal how timber companies that are processing end products can use right to farm laws in a defense against like formaldehyde exposure in Mississippi, for example. That's how they're winning. And that's why we see business firms, if you look over here at the moderately low rural racial minority level, there is no low rural racial minority level in the United States. Just to point that out. It's very, very crucial to think about our demographic trends and in rural racial minority levels. But look at the high rural racial minority levels, the outcomes by party type. This is all cases, right? All cases. Look how much business firms win in these states with high rural racial minority levels and CAFOs. Now, you could look at this and say, but look, there's so many fewer cases being filed. That has to do with systematic disenfranchisement from the legal system. We know about this through heirs property. That's how we help explain it in the book. Simultaneously, we see by far most of the case law happening in these moderately low rural racial minority states, if that makes sense. Okay, I just have a few minutes left. So I want to talk about ways in which we can disrupt this dispossession, and we get into this in the book. Jack mentioned when he kicked this off is that we're trying to do direct action legal aid to rural communities. So I know this because I chatted with Rick Welch's class at Syracuse not too long ago, and I said, let's look at New York and see if you search for right to farm laws on Google, what comes up. And you'll see one of the top hits is our website that has these state summaries. So it's enabled people around the country to at least go and see what's happening with their right to farm law in their state. I don't know if that happens in every state. It's the way it is in Kentucky, Illinois, Wisconsin, and New York. I haven't tried in every state. Well, provide direct legal aid so people can be empowered over what the actual content of these laws is. Another thing that we're doing is working it into discussions of land access and justice. And so we're working with the National Young Farmers Coalition to get the word out about right to farm laws, and also bring it into a faceted way of getting people who have been dispossessed their land rights. Talking about it at Farm Aid. They're the ones who help make our book free online. And then there's Amy again at with the National Farmers Union. So make the book publicly accessible, this information publicly accessible, so people can use it. Now you might say that's not enough, right? It's not enough. I would agree with you completely. When we talk about this at the end of the book, is another key route is we have to reduce the government subsidization of these types of operations, which empowers them legislatively. So one of the programs that I like to focus on when you're thinking about the mass subsidization of corporate agribusiness is the USDA's 2022 Spot Market Hog Pandemic Program. Any single operation could get up to over $500,000. Each operation, $500,000 of funds based on this $54 a head payment, up to 10,000 head. This happened, through their pandemic program. Legal entities were welcome to apply for this funding, and they didn't have to disclose who their beneficial owners were. Why are we doing this, right? You could have a series of LLCs that connect back to the same umbrella business firm, and they're raking in these funds. That's a way of dispossessing smaller farmers. So further, the Government Accountability Office, looking at the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, in some cases could not even determine the clear ownership structure of who the producers were that were applying for funds. We've got to cap down and be more deliberate about where these funds are going and coming from. Another key element is antitrust enforcement. All right, I want to skip through this because I'm out of time. Another way is to change the finance. Let's look at who the Farm Credit Service Agency, Farm Credit System, is giving funds to through the Farm Service Agency. This is some work we've done separately showing how we're actually providing loans to a lot of these multinational corporate agribusinesses. That's again giving disproportionate market power to the biggest actors. And this is the last note that I think is important to think about, and I won't cover the others, but we have to derail the cycle between legislative influence and governmental funding. So I just want to conclude with this note, and this is the very end of our book. These are the way that we end our book, is that markets, laws, and rights become what their government makes of them. A more direct and accessible democratic trifecta, or an exclusive and highly consolidated authoritarian trifecta. Locally led and community-based efforts show that direct democratization of agriculture in the face of great but unjust power is possible. So the task now at hand is building a democratic tapestry for agriculture where the people no longer fear for their future, but look forward to the abundance of tomorrow based upon the access of today. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. Super interesting. I don't have a ton of background in like how some of these litigation processes play out, but I'm curious for the cases that you had read about, were the verdicts always just regarding like financial compensation, or could there have been a situation maybe where say if there was like a CAFO that lost a case, they would have to enforce like environmental best management practices on their farm to protect the surrounding communities?
That's a great question. Another, to help answer that, it's also helpful. This is something I didn't have any time to talk about. Which the federal level. Concerned of widely there to be an injunction, not just issues of monetary compensation through nuisance litigation or punitive damages. I can't answer specifically what you're saying on a national level because it varies so much by state. That's one reason, like in the book, we say, go to your specific state and see how the mediation process potentially plays out. So in New York, for example, and in New Jersey, there's a lot more involvement of environmental agencies in mediation processes before you can go to court. And we talk about that a little bit. Maybe that's something we should pay more attention to, because in the Northeast, we have more equitable outcomes. Yes, that can happen, but it varies, and it's mostly in the Northeast. I guess would be the reasonable way to answer it.
Could you talk about the other aspects of the elements of private property that maybe can't be described through capital or money?
So when I think of property rights, I think about a bundle of rights. Like, and I've heard some of my colleagues describe it as a bundle of sticks. Not that you want to hit the stick. Not necessarily mean it that way. But what a lot of these cases are based upon, the nuisance litigation that somebody like the Parkers would file, is a protection of my enjoyment of the property and your personal health as a facet of enjoyment of your personal property that you reside upon or you own, and the potential for future uses. So the use and enjoyment of your property then compensation or even an injunction. So if you're talking about future use of property, you can imagine that that facet of your property right may actually mean a lot more, because you couldn't perhaps would have otherwise if that operation hadn't been cited next door. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for a wonderful presentation. From a layperson point of view, I would assume that in the US, the more lawyered up you are, the higher the chances of winning any legal case. And I'm wondering how much of that effect that, you know, if you're a small farmer going against a bigger, more organized, lawyered up organization, you're more likely to lose. And to what extent do you see that in other areas outside this, that, you know, how much lawyered up you are and your likelihood of winning a case?
What farmers say when we talk to them about right to farm laws is, yeah, we just don't have legal aid. And glad to have this slide up. I know on Lisa Lewis's work, we had a piece that's about the lawyer shortage actually being most acute in the West, not in the South. About that, we talked about a little bit in the front. But people are still going to court despite that. But all this to say, to be even more deliberate, when we looked at 190 cases that had dispositive right to the right to farm, the farm, but and the reason I mentioned that is only because we talked about this too, that, oh man, that higher level of state. You're exactly right. Yeah. Point.
kind of build off that question. I'm curious, what is the general opinion of right to farm law from small farms, like family farms? Are they aware that it's not serving them maybe in the way that it's advertised by other organizations?
Yes, that's a great question. So when I first got interested in this small farms losing because of these laws. It was through organizing and research I was doing with communities on industrial scale animal feeding operations. That's when I first heard about it. Now, when we've gone and talked about, including the Alabama Farm Expo, when we go to talk with the National Farmers Union, or when we go to Farm Aid, these places, most farmers actively farming have not heard of these laws until it's too late. So they're not aware of their content and their meaning. And we field some really interesting questions from people that, randomly email. Twice it's been about Great Pyrenees dogs, which actually there's a great New York case where the government sided with some farmers and helped them defend nuisance litigation when a neighbor sued because they said their dogs bark too much. I had 2 emails from people about these dogs. I also have Great Pyrenees. I love the breed. But we'll get sort of like dismayed because most farmers think that these laws should be protecting the land from suburban and urban sprawl. These are not land use laws. So that's like the dismay, or it's a fence line issue, but they're not doing what they think they should do or what they want them to do. Yeah, it's a great question.
I think so. We have a question from online and also so they can hear better.
Oh, I see.
So thank you. Dunga Kiti says online, how much does your work intersect with social activists? For example, the NWC or farming associations that could work to try and advocate for more fair policies.
Sorry about the mic. We work a lot with those groups. So the National the National Farmer Union, we were at their last convention. That's Emily. We go back. That's where she's at, talking to farmers. We'll be there again in 2 weeks. We're doing a breakout session on these laws and giving away books. Thanks to Farm Aid. The NAACP has played an active role in some other states in the Southeast. I have not worked directly with them. I think it's a great idea. The Rural Empowerment Organization and the North Carolina Justice Network. Those were 2 groups I met as a graduate student that also had a major role in inspiring this work. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Loka. Oh, we're out of time. Thanks again.